Hi, everyone. I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar, Navigating Class 6 Permits, What to Expect in Wyoming. So thank you all so much for joining. This webinar is a collaboration between the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute and the School of Energy Resources. The Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute was created and is financially supported by the Wyoming State Legislature, as is the School of Energy Resources. And EORI's focus is to work with Wyoming oil producers to increase oil production and, as a result, increase tax revenues of the state. In addition, EORI has a lot of expertise around permitting and CO2 capture, use, and storage. I will tell you, here at the School of Energy Resources, we're really grateful for our partners at EORI, who we work with on these issues on a daily basis. So welcome, everyone. I am Holly Krecka. I'm the Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources, and would like to welcome you all again for this webinar today. If you're not familiar with the School of Energy Resources, it was created and to be housed at the University of Wyoming, but it was created by the Wyoming Legislature and separately funded from the rest of the university, and we have separate governance through the Energy Resources Council. At the School of Energy Resources, our mission is energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming. And under that mission, certainly carbon capture, use, and storage is a huge opportunity, we believe, for the state, and we're working really hard to make that opportunity become a reality. So we've, through our colleagues at Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, we've, and working with industry partners here at SER, we found there's a lot of questions about Class 6 permits. And so we'd like to address some of those in this webinar today. So we have 3 panelists that have prepared about a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answers, so that if you have a question that's not answered during the presentation, you'll get a chance to ask that. And please do that using either the chat or the Q&A functions in this webinar. If we can't get to all the questions, we will record them all, and we'll find a way to either email registrants answers to the questions, or we'll put them on our website, or both. So we'll make sure that we get to all the questions asked today. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our panelists are the 3 principal investigators of the Wyoming Carbon Safe Project. And under that project, we're focused on Class 6 permits, among other opportunities. And so our panelists are going to each introduce themselves. And we have with us Kip Coddington, Scott Quillinan, and Fred McLaughlin. Gentlemen, would you please provide your bios and go ahead and give your presentation? Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, Holly. I'll go first, guys, if that's okay. So I'm Scott Quillinan. I direct the Center for Economic Geology Research here at the School of Energy Resources. As Holly mentioned, I am the co-principal investigator with these 2 fine gentlemen on the Wyoming Carbon Safe Project. I'm also a licensed registered professional geologist here in the state of Wyoming. So I've spent the entirety of my career working on energy-related challenges in Wyoming, much of that on carbon capture and storage. So Fred, let me pass it to you.
Sure, thanks, Scott. My name is Fred McLaughlin. I'm a senior research scientist here at the School of Energy Resources. I'm a geologist by trade and the technical lead on the Wyoming Carbon Safe Project. And much like Scott, I've spent most of my career working on Wyoming geologic issues. Kip?
And I'm Kip Coddington. I'm a chemical engineer and low carbon lawyer. And I have the privilege of directing the Center for Energy Regulation and Policy Analysis at SER, or SERPA. And there I lead an interdisciplinary team of lawyers, economists, and policy experts that try to bridge the gap between technology on the one hand and commercial deployments on the other. So it's a privilege to be here. Thank you.
All right, thanks, guys. I'll kick us off. Christine, do you want to turn the slide for us? And we can just start on the next slide. So good afternoon, folks. It's a pleasure to be here today and to share our thoughts regarding Class 6 permitting in Wyoming. As you know, since October, Wyoming is the second state to have primacy over Class 6 wells. So like many of you, we're trying to wrap our brain around what comprises a complete application and what we can do to help this process move forward. So before I get going, I just wanted to state a few facts. Most of the folks on this registration list are Wyoming operators. So there are folks out there that already have a pretty decent understanding of what a Class 6 well is, who the regulatory body is, and how you begin. So we're just going to kind of start on that framework and build up. I would also like to say that we are in no way representing the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. We are a few academics down here in Laramie, just like you, trying to figure out what these permits consist of. So these are just our interpretations of the regulators or of the regulations. So don't take what we say, or please take what we say with a grain of salt. And from that perspective, we come at this problem from both the Wyoming Carbon Safe Project, where we're actively working through a couple of Class 6 permits to commercialize a carbon storage complex near Gillette, Wyoming. We also have the privilege of being part of the Plains CO2 reduction partnership, teamed with our friends up in North Dakota at the EERC, and we're working with them to develop a roadmap for Class 6 permitting in Wyoming. So we come at this problem from the research perspective, and we're happy to share our thoughts. So with that, let me hand it over to Fred, who is our technical lead on the Carbon Safe project. He's going to walk us through some of the geology questions that we received in the registration, and then we're going to hand it to Kip, who can talk a little bit more about the law, policy, and commercial aspects that we've received. So Fred.
Thanks, Scott. Christine, next slide, please. So as we expected a diverse audience today, we thought it'd be useful to share a visualization of a proposed storage site. This was an early example from our Carbon Safe program up near Gillette at the Dry Fork Station. It has since evolved, but again, it's a nice teaching tool and a nice way to introduce some of the major technical elements of a Class 6 permit. And again, the next couple of slides, as Scott mentioned, will be a high-level look, because we only have half an hour, of some of those technical aspects. So with respect to the subsurface, of course, the major points of activity for characterization and assessment relative to the permit are your injection and confinement zones. And here, for example, we show 3 primary injection zones. Those are the yellow sand bodies in that conceptual diagram on the right, the Lakota, the Hewlett, and the Melaleuca member. Between those, we have multiple confining bodies, which need attention in the permit, and one big confining body called just a grand package of Cretaceous shales right above those confining zones and below the lowermost USDW. The lowermost USDW is the point of protection of the permit. Scott will get into this in a later slide. And what a lot of the activity focuses on is proving that all operations within the storage site here will not have any effect on that USDW. With respect to some of the surface technical aspects, there's other environmental pieces that need to go into a Class 6 well. This includes surface and more shallow groundwater even than the lowermost USDW. There's also infrastructure that is investigated. This could include stuff like legacy wells. With respect to operations as a technical element, of course, you have to model what this project might look like specific to the well. You also have to monitor and complete these wells to Class 6 standards. We'll touch on that briefly later. Last but not least, one of the technical elements that we must address is closure of the wells relative to the DEQ's process. Next slide, please. Again, I think everybody was interested with respect to the questions we received of what the technical workflow looks like. So here, very simply, we've summarized it into kind of how we've built out our program. Again, as Scott mentioned, we're more focused on the research, but this is very applicable. We have to get to that commercial state at the end. So of course, we always start, and much like other well permits, Class 1, for instance, with legacy data collection and analysis. We have to spend time characterizing that lowermost USDW and other USDWs if they exist within your storage site region. All of this data then goes into modeling and CO2 injection simulations. We'll have some more of this later in the program to help determine what your area of review is. That differs from a class 1 well, and again, we'll have examples of this later on. Two different things, two different for a class 6 permit are both risk assessment and corrective action strategy and an MVA strategy. These are, again, designed to take into account injection activities and protect the lowermost USDW. With these existing technical workflows, if you work through it, and this isn't even including the piece that Kip will get to, which includes the financial assurances and regulatory pieces, you can work to compile and submit a class 6 permit to drill. Wyoming, we are very lucky. We do have a lot of existing subsurface data from years of oil production, gas production. But it still depends on where you are in the state and how much existing legacy data you have going forward to meet the rigorous state of modeling area review determination. There's several other technical pieces we'd like to point out that might need new field data complete. These include site-specific field operations and data collections, such as baseline groundwater modeling or monitoring, soil gas monitoring, and you might need some well-specific data after you drill your first well. Last but not least, we'd like to point out that all new data coming from your well must go back into your modeling and simulations and other programs, cascade effect, MVA risk assessment, to continually be shared with the administration.
Hey, Fred, we do have one clarification question. Can you explain or spell out MVA? What does that stand for?
Oh, sure. Monitoring, verification, and accounting. Apologies. We'll have a slide on that a little bit later. And again, I guess we've done similar talks like this once or twice. So I do invite my fellow panelists to jump in with any thoughts as needed. Next slide, please.
So Fred, if I can take this slide. I threw this in there because the first 60 to 70% of your permit is all based or can be based on legacy data that's out there. And as you're pulling it together, a lot of that data are the same databases that your reviewers are going to be looking to check on. So I just listed them here. One in particular, the aquifer descriptions. There's a pretty good description in the groundwater plans that the Wyoming Water Development Commission groundwater reports hold. So I would just draw your attention to that. But that was the whole reason for this slide here, Fred. Back to you.
Thanks, Scott. Next slide, Christine. So we'd like to introduce some of the general and site geology specific analysis tasks and technical tasks that must be completed for a class 6 well. Of course, one of the first things you need to do is compile a general and site geologic report from available sources, but specific to both injection and confining zones. So this is one way it differs slightly, say, from a class 1. You must spend time trying to determine how your seals work in a region and if they'll be compatible to your injection goals. You must build from this existing data structural and isopac maps and cross sections. Time must be spent defining the faults and fracture networks within the region, location, extent, and orientation. Again, this is one of the major risks identified by the DEQ for injection processes, and having a good idea of where these faults and fractures are located and their characters is really important for developing your risk assessment and corrective action plan. You must go through the seismic history of the region to see if it has a natural ability to have seismic events and define those. There's USGS and WS, Wyoming State Geologic Survey investigations into both of these or into these processes. And last but not least, you must have geomechanical and geochemical analysis done on fluids, for instance, within your injection zones. Geomechanical data from both your confining and injection zones. And last but not least, the data that you build from your general and site geology evaluations must be sufficient to demonstrate the effectiveness of the injection and confining zones to meet your operational goals. Scott or Kip, do you have anything to add? I guess I should talk about the figure on the right. This is an example again from Carbon Safe, Wyoming Carbon Safe. So the previous slide had a cartoony cross section or a schematic of what we hope to do at the site. This is built on more precise well data. This is a 2D cross section that with a vertical exaggeration of 6x of the different strata at our target storage site, at our first storage site. On the right, you'll see we have greatly delineated the different lithologies within the zones. I mentioned 3 zones earlier: the Lakota Formation, the Hewlett, and the Menalusa. And here you can see actually how varied they are. Of course, heterogeneity is one of the big things that has to be addressed in the permit as well.
So Fred, you're showing one cross section here. I believe the permit calls for a second cross section that would be in the perpendicular direction.
Correct.
To this one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Scott. Next slide, please, Christine. Scott, I think you're going to take a shot.
Yeah, I'll take a swing at this one. So modeling and simulations. We always get a lot of questions on what constitutes a model. What software do we need to use to meet the permit requirements? And my answer to that is, I don't think it's up to the software brand. I think it's up to the geoscientists that are putting this application together, that you accurately represent the subsurface. So you need to be able to represent where the CO2 plume is going to go. You need to be able to represent where the pressure plume is going to expand to. You need to represent and determine risk for any displaced fluids that are out there. And at the end of the day, you're going to turn your application in, and it's going to be signed by a professional geologist. It's going to be signed by a professional engineer. It's going to be reviewed by professional geologists and professional engineers. So I don't think it's a matter of which software you use. I think it's a matter of how can you get to that defensible, reproducible model that can be reviewed both by your team and the team at Department of Environmental Quality. So that's what I have to say about modeling. Fred, back to you.
Thanks, Scott. I will say this is one of the most important technical pieces. This is followed through the life cycle of the entirety of the project. This must be updated with monitoring data at different periods to the project's history. And it also determines, how much time and effort you have to put into the MVA determinations and strategy and your risk assessment. So again, having enough geologic data, either legacy or new, to characterize the injection and confining zones is very important. Next slide, Christine. So we want to spend just a minute talking about the area of review. This is an example from our friends at the ERC from a previous carbon safe phase. So on the right, you see one of the storage complex simulation results. And we go through dozens of these, again, because we are research focused, but also to try to determine, optimal operational strategies, et cetera. So what we see here are several different spots where we've identified good spots to put injection wells. And then the smaller plumes around them, the smaller polygons you see around them, which are either green or blue, are the actual size of the CO2 plume under those injection scenarios. And this injection scenario was 50 million tons of CO2 injected at those 5 different sites over 25 years. The larger black circle around it is what's described as the pressure plume. And I will point out that if you're doing class 6 monitoring, you wouldn't actually do it like this. You'd have to have an area of review simulation specific to each well. This, of course, was for research purposes, so we could kind of have a better idea of the grander extent. So with respect to class 6 area of review determinations, there's 2 primary plumes, one being the CO2 plume itself and its aerial extent relative to the injection well, and then the second being that pressure front plume that you see in black there, which has a much greater size, of course, because you're displacing fluids within the reservoir to begin with. Now, one of the complications with this, and this is, of course, a very large model that the ERC helped build for phase 2 of Wyoming Carbon Safe, is we didn't put any boundaries within the geology itself. So there's no natural stratigraphic traps or structures. We just allowed everything to migrate relative to a relatively simple pressure algorithm that's built into the model. So being able to define regionally some of those structures and boundaries has a great impact on this area review. And that's actually one of the things we're focused on science-wise in our current phase of Wyoming Carbon Safe, is to do enough downhole testing and to do a better, get a more defined look at some of the seismic data we're able to gather to try to determine better limits on geologic boundaries. And that is all I have to say on area review. Scott, anything to add there?
No, I think you covered it.
All right, thanks.
Next slide, we're a little behind time too, so I'm going to try and pick up on the next couple of slides.
Thanks for the.
So I will mention a little bit on aquifer characterization here. The whole purpose of the UIC program is to protect underground sources of drinking water and groundwater supply in particular. So I would just encourage everybody out there that is, as you're putting those applications together, look through it with that lens, right? Everything you do is about protecting those underground sources of drinking water, and every part of your application should kind of have that thought behind it. Next slide, please, Christine. And back to you, Fred.
Thanks, Scott. So in the interest of time, I'll go through this relatively quickly. So with respect to your modeling, your assessment of those surface structures like legacy wells, and your injection simulations, you must build a monitoring, verification, and assessment strategy for environmental surveillance and excursion detection, prevention, and other control. So it has to be life cycle to include all operations and post-injection phase. And of course, pre-injection is just as important to get a baseline character of some of those systems to see if you have actually made an impact. So during operations, monitoring needs to focus on both injection zones and the USDWs within the site. Injection zones can have direct or indirect measurement of these plume extent with respect to monitoring. USDS, or the US drinking water formations, must have direct monitoring of the groundwater quality. Also must take into account any geochemical changes or pressure changes. Within the well itself, you must do injection pressure, direct measurement, rate and volume, pressure on the annulus between tubing and casing, as well as corrosion monitoring and other in situ well tests. And depending on the guidance from the administration of the DEQ, monitoring could also include soil gas and surface air monitoring. Next slide, please, Christine. Correlative with monitoring is risk assessment and corrective action. So there's a specific risk activity matrix provided by the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. It's in Appendix A of their Chapter 24. With respect to Wyoming, or some of the study areas we've looked at, we believe the biggest risk to some of these operations are going to be any legacy wells, existing geologic structures, faults and fractures, the competency of the confining zones. As you know, geology is very diverse, and confining zone character can change both laterally and vertically. But there's also other risks with respect to surface issues, such as ownership risks in operations. Kip might touch on this briefly. And any risk identified must have a corrective action strategy built in to include remediation. So, and some corrective action might be necessitated prior to injection, or it could be phased. Next slide, please. Some of the additional requirements needed for a Class 6, of course, you have to have your operational data built in there. What's your maximum rates? What's the duration? How long does the project last, et cetera. There's different testing and monetary requirements. The mechanical integrity of these wells are very important to know. So there's some rigorous testing involved with respect to that. The completion requirements of these wells must exceed the standards developed for such materials. as stated within the permit application. So these are different materials than you might use for a standard well, but it's still off-the-shelf material. And then, of course, you must have a plugging and abandonment plan approved for your permit. Next slide, please. Kip, I will hand the mic to you.
Thank you very much, Fred. So I just have one slide, and I'm going to talk about the non-geologic aspects of a Class 6 permit. And just to back all this off, so what we've heard from Scott and Fred are the geologic assessments to identify and appropriately characterize a geologic storage site that can contain carbon dioxide for eternity, effectively, and that it will not endanger any underground sources of drinking water. That is the geology aspects of the program, but then that is surrounded by a host of commercial and legal and regulatory policy pieces that also are reflected in Wyoming's Class 6 regulations. And in just this one slide, I'm going to take 1 minute and just tick off those major policy pieces, if you will. Firstly, the Class 6 permit is just one permit of several that would be required for any type of energy project. And there's nothing unique about that. If you were building a power plant or LNG import terminal, export terminal, you'd have to comply with the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all those host of environmental permits under federal and state law. And you have to do the same thing here. So again, we're just talking about the Class 6 permit that is focused on underground sources of drinking water. But of course, there's a host of other permits that you're going to need, just like you would need for any energy project. And there's nothing new about that. And you do need to be aware that Wyoming is one of the states that has a statutory regime for these kind of projects. So Wyoming has statutes on pore space, for example. But you also need to be cognizant of those Wyoming state statutes as well that bear on these projects, but are not necessarily explicitly tied into the Class 6 program. Secondly, these Class 6 permits do require a variety of plans, as Fred and Scott have touched upon. You have to submit, and it's envisioned that these plans are submitted at the time of application, and then they are updated throughout the course of the project. So every time the size of the plume changes, for example, it is envisioned that these plans would have to be revised. So you're going to need a corrective action plan, which, as Fred said, is addressing pre-existing well bores within the aerial extent of the project. And again, you're just making sure that those aren't potential leakage pathways. And as that plume might increase over time, that corrective action plan may pick up additional existing penetrations that would have to be addressed. Also, as Fred said, you do have to have a testing and monitoring plan, which again is typical with many environmental permitting programs. You have to have a well plugging plan, and you have to have a emergency and remedial response plan. Nextly, there are financial responsibility considerations, and we really don't have enough time to consider this, but this really requires some pretty sophisticated economic expertise where an assessment has to be done of potential risk associated with the projects, and then financial assurance. Some financial mechanism has to be presented to potentially address those risks. And just 30 seconds about risk. I think many geologists would say that these projects are of course well managed. They're going to be heavily regulated. So risk here is it's real, but they're going to be addressed through the siting process. But these are more also investment type risks. This would be the types of concerns that an investment banker or an investor in a project would need. So again, all this is doable, but we could spend a lot of time on financial responsibility, and that's also specified in the regulations. There are reporting considerations. The owner and operator of a project has to report both to DEQ and to federal EPA on a schedule, depending upon the nature of this subject matter at issue. There are permit timing considerations, so you need to think about this from a commercial point of view. And there is a little bit of a chicken and egg thing here, that you need the data to apply for the permit, but you might need the reverse. And that's why what Scott has said, to the extent that you can rely upon existing data that is favorable, and I think the permitting regulations encourage the use of public data. And of course, there are various test wells that can separately be drilled under other programs to collect data. Secondly, or next to last, there are these permits are subject to public notice and public participation considerations, as they should be, because public acceptance is a key part of this program. So it's envisioned when DEQ has a draft permit that it is going to release, whether it's going to disapprove it or approve it, that will be made public. There'll be opportunities for public comment. Members of the public can request a public hearing, and then these permits are just subject to all the normal administrative procedures that you would have with DEQ for any other type of permit. And then just some commercial considerations. I mean, we do get a lot of project finance questions, and obviously financing these these projects are key. Two big financial considerations are Section 45Q, which I'm certain everyone in the audience is aware of that, and California's low carbon fuel standard. The Class 6 regulation is obviously intimately related to both of those, but both of those programs have separate requirements that you would certainly want to be cognizant of. So you shouldn't assume, for example, that you've got your Class 6 permit, and that means, for example, that you're going to be complying with the California low carbon fuel standard. There might be some additional homework there. There will be some additional homework there you're going to have to do. So with that, I'm done with my piece, and I think we're back to Dr. Kretka for Q&A. Christine, is that, I think we're at the last slide. Oh yeah, just for more information. So there's a whole wealth of information at federal EPA, and these regulations are available on the website for Wyoming's administrative rules. That's it, I'm done. Dr. Kretka, back to you.
Thanks, Kip. Thanks, Scott and Fred. So yeah, as Kip said, now we're moving on to the question and answer section of this webinar. And it looks like we have quite a few good ones rolling in through this webinar. We also had some submitted ahead of time, so I'll start with those and then move to those that have been submitted during the webinar. So our first question is from Peter Wold. And that question is pretty high level, a good introduction here. So what is the economic benefit to an operator for permitting and operating a Class 6 well? What are the liabilities to an operator?
So do you want me to take that one first?
Sure.
Go for it, Kip.
So the economic benefit is that Class 6 wells, truly, and I'm not overstating it, they are a gatekeeper to a low carbon economy. And that we're seeing that every day, either through a variety of low carbon products, except for CO2 EOR, you would expect to see these types of permits and programs to enable finance, such as 45Q and the low carbon fuel standard. So yes, any kind of permit is a cost, but in this instance, it's a gateway to potential upside for a low carbon future, and certainly technology such as CCS and CCUS. In terms of liability, the regulations do address that through the required submission of insurance plans, and again, financial responsibility and financial assurance. There are questions about those long-term risks that you would need to talk to your insurance company with, or investment banker. But we're reasonably confident that those risks can be managed as well.
Okay, thanks. So I'll move to one question that we've gotten a couple times, and I'm not sure if we have the answer because, but I'll let you guys weigh in if you have a sense of this. Because obviously the Wyoming Carbon Safe Project is a research project, but I think folks are interested in what would be the estimated cost to prepare a commercial Class 6 application.
So Holly, I'll take a swing, but nobody can hold me to this. So we've thought about this. We've thought about what it takes to, outside of drilling the well, what it takes for just the labor, getting through the permit, doing all the modeling, doing all the analyses. And I think you could safely say that you're north of 500K, maybe not north of 700K, but please don't hold me to that. Panelists, you guys have a better thought?
I think the odd variable is the regulatory piece and how much that might cost, Kip. So the technical side, I think we could take a good swing at, but I'd whiff on that piece, Kip. What do you think?
Yeah, again, these are great questions, but you're going to have to hire an economist to do this estimate on financial assurance. There aren't a large number of economists that do this work, so I'd imagine they're probably going to make a nice fee. So yes, I mean, you're going to spend some money on these, but again, you know, with any kind of major permitting program, you're going to hire consultants, you're going to hire lawyers. This is maybe going to be a little bit more because you're underground and it's a new program. But I would say, you know, so are there cost barriers to entry for this? Yes, probably. And I would say in that instance, that's probably a good thing, because I think we want well-capitalized companies that are doing these projects. We've got to do them right. But yeah, they're not going to be inexpensive.
Yeah.
I think if there's any take home we tried to portray here, it does take a diverse group of experts. Might only take 2 professional signatures to sign off on it, but there's certainly, as we've learned from trying to work through these, there's a lot of different brains involved.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so we have a few technical questions now. Are there any requirements about considering the chemical reactions of CO2 with formation of mineral rocks?
I can take that one too. Fred, do you mind?
Go ahead.
So yes, there is. You have to look at the compatibility of the CO2 as it reacts with the brine and the rocks in formation. And you have to basically look if there's going to be any ill effects from that. You can do that through 2 ways. You can do it through experiments, or you can do it through geochemical modeling. But yes, you absolutely have to look at CO2 going into the rock and what effects are going to come out of reactions from the rock and the brine.
Thanks. Okay, what defines the edge of the pressure front? A 10 psi difference from static or something greater?
That's a good question. So according to the EPA, it's where your new pressure front might push formation fluids, not CO2, up into overlying USDWs. But we've modeled pressure fronts. It's one of the early arguments we had time and time again. So the last extent we showed was the edge of the pressure front. So.
Okay, would AOR characterization have to be done on each receiving interval?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so the AOR is the 3-dimensional extent of the plume and the receiving interval and everything above it. So for every formation you're injecting into will have its own individual AOR.
Okay.
And that's per well.
Per well.
Yeah, it's not just for the project, it's for every injector.
Perfect, thanks. Okay, next one. Legacy wells are an issue both for both the CO2 plume and pressure front, or just the plume?
The plume's where it's most important, Holly. It's a very good question, and that might be the place where it necessitates corrective action. But you have to, for the risk assessment, you have to explore all the legacy wells within that AOR, even that pressure plume,
and within 1 mile of the AOR,
and within 1 mile of the AOR, yes. And that would be characterizing those and pointing out ways that corrective actions might be needed.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we have a question, I can answer this one. Will these slides be available? Sure, we'll make the slides available. We're also recording this webinar, so we'll make that available as well. So on to the next one. Okay, let's see. Kip, this one's for you. Proof of confinement. Can you provide a legal definition?
Ooh, that's now, Dr. Crick, I thought you said I wasn't going to get any hard questions. So I would say that is a regulatory determination that is made by DEQ, and that determination has not been made yet. So there really is no legislative history or particular legal standard that I could point to. I will say it's going to depend upon a lot of these models that both Scott and Fred have talked about. So at the end of the day, that's going to be a science-based determination, and it's going to be a discussion between the owner and operator of the project, and they will be defending their model and what the data show, and that will be a discussion. And so it'll be more of that scientific discussion as opposed to, a lawyer like me showing up and said, hey, we met your definition, we're done. This is going to be a thoughtful, detailed, challenging, difficult scientific discussion, as it should be. Okay,
thanks. Okay, so we have another one, more specific. If a company seeking a Class 6 permit knows a small fault exists in our site, but we suspect it is not active and not transmissive because we produce oil trapped under it, then does the company still have to declare this fault in our permit application, or because the fault is insignificant, can we declare no fault exists?
You have to declare it, but you can define it.
Yeah.
Right. That's one of the, you have to characterize absolutely. It as open, closed, is it safe or not safe, but definitely divulge.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Agreed.
Okay, let's see. We have one question from Wendy Lowe. Wendy's asking, I see that DEQ is in the process of promulgating changes to their Class 6 well regulations. These appear to be necessary for Wyoming rules to be as stringent as federal. Is that your understanding? And the hearing is on May 18th.
So I will take a run at that. And again, we can't speak for DEQ. So we are aware that those amendments were posted a couple of weeks ago. We have not studied them. I think it's our understanding that those don't bear on primacy because the primacy was already approved last fall. So yeah, I think that question would have to go to DEQ, but primacy exists.
Thanks, Kip. Okay, I have one question from Christian. How does the CO2 get to a well? I assume that is specific to carbon safe, or?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know. There's several different sources you could have. And the operational stuff on top can vary, depending on how much compression you need, but probably pipeline, I guess.
Yep. Probably pipeline.
Some small projects may truck it, but pipeline is how it's going to get there.
There are, yeah, not relevant to Wyoming, but there are projects that are also planning on shipping, like in Norway, but over the ocean, which we don't have. So, yep, principally we're thinking pipelines, and EORI's done a lot of work in that space. So, okay. So Christian also asks, is the 660 square mile AOR arbitrary, or is that going to be a typical AOR?
Oh, that's a good question. So again, I showed that, and I hope I put the caveat on there very strong. That was an early kind of just simulation, testing different variables. It's not arbitrary. Each AOR will be specific to the site, and the AOR will change, actually, we believe, somewhat after you go in and you drill the well specifically, you get new data. That's what we're working on now, is refining that AOR. So definitely not arbitrary, definitely site specific. For instance, if you lived in a structural trap, which a lot of oil fields do, you have closure on every side, that would be the full extent of your AOR as modeled. So unless the fault was leaky. And that was the previous question, but yeah.
Okay, thanks. So we have another question. I think we can talk about this, but we can't speak for DEQ or the state, as we've already mentioned, but I'll read the question as written. So is Wyoming DEQ or the state in favor of this type of activity? Oil and gas has become more scrutinized, and class 1-2 disposals have become increasingly difficult to permit even on permit renewals. So certainly very timely.
So I can take a run at that. And again, I'm not going to speak for, I think the state of Wyoming's position on these issues generally speaks for itself. And so I'm not going to speak for them. I will say what's curious, I mentioned the California low carbon fuel standard, which is a rigorous financial mechanism for decarbonizing transportation fuels in California, including fuels imported into California. And I don't think anyone would accuse California of being having the same views of the state of Texas. But under the California low carbon fuel standard, you can do these projects in enhanced oil recovery projects. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency recognizes storage during enhanced oil recovery as a legal form of storage for compliance purposes with the Clean Air Act. Section 45Q, the tax incentive, acknowledges CO2 enhanced oil recovery. So without getting into political views, the law is pretty straightforward across the political spectrum that storage and CO2 EOR is legally recognized, accepted, and encouraged.
Thanks, Kip. So we have another question. I think this is on the phase of the CO2. So Christian is wondering if it's dense phase injection.
Everything we've modeled is dense phase CO2.
Yep. Okay. Kathy Bolkin from EERC is asking, do the certified PG and PE have to be approved by the Wyoming DEQ before reviewing? Do we know that?
We don't know that for sure. So it's a good question.
So I assume that's with the pertaining to a third-party review that DEQ would send out. I can't answer that. I think that would be a DEQ question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, I think we've already answered this one. Let's see, we have one. I think we've already answered it, but tell me if you disagree or if you want to add anything. From Kelly, what criteria do you use to define the edge of the pressure front? What is your change in pressure at the front?
Yeah, I think we went through that already.
Okay.
So
Let's see, okay. From Ben Schiffer, is pore space ownership a consideration for the Class 6 application and review by Wyoming DEQ or QD?
Yes, I will take yes. So pore space, obviously, we're talking about storing CO2 deep underground in rocks, and pores are minuscule voids. But the state of Wyoming has recognized pore space as a property right, and Wyoming law says whoever, for state and fee lands, whoever owns the surface owns the pores. And the Class 6 program requires a showing both in the regulations and in the application that all necessary property rights have been obtained. So yes, property rights and acquisition of the pore space is intimately intertwined with the Class 6 program.
Thanks, Kip. Okay, from David Skull, can you provide guidance for the monitoring well strategy? Is there a minimum number of wells for geophysical, seal, reservoir, and USDW monitoring wells?
So I can take that one, Fred, and then please tell me where I'm wrong. So I would say this is going to be site specific. You're going to have to look at your site. You're going to have to see where the risks are, and that's where you're going to place your monitoring network. So I don't think you can go into it knowing that you need 1 monitoring well or 10 monitoring wells. I think you just have to have a defensible application so that you can show you're accurately monitoring the risk. Fred?
I agree. It tells you the zones you have to monitor, but that might be something you have to work through with the administrator based on the models and simulations and the risk assessments you've done.
And Scott and Fred, correct me if I'm wrong, but the monitoring isn't just limited to the lowermost underground source of drinking water. I mean, you have to do some surface monitoring. I mean, you have to sort of look at the plume, either, with indirect or direct technologies. I think it's kind of a suite of potential, receptors that you have to look at applying sound science. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just in the injection zone, but there's some zones above it too, and the USDWs.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we have a question from Ray Clanton. How much variation would you expect in the baseline CO2 measurements in the drinking water zone due to measurement errors or problems?
That's a good question too. I think there's not a lot of room for error, at least in those types of measurements. I mean, I think it's fairly precise. We've got a task right now looking at seasonal variance, due to different physical activities, natural activities. Also, we know that there's geochemical differences between the CO2 we'll put into the injection zone and that's found naturally, that you get from, say, burning coal or something. Scott, any thoughts on that? Because you worked on that for a long time.
Yeah, so I think that's the reason of starting your baseline monitoring 1 year in advance of injection, so that you can understand that fluctuation between seasons, between day and night. There's a lot of things that CO2 does fluctuate a lot in the soil, and you need to understand that and capture that before injection.
Okay, thanks. Okay, let's see. You mentioned a permit to construct a class 6. How does this become a permit to inject a class 6? Are they two completely different permits, or one permit which has an extra signature added to it after we do something?
Kip, you want to take a swing at that? I used that language earlier because we had used a similar slide to discuss EPA rules. Permit to construct is not, I think, found in the DEQ rules, but I'll back off there. That's where that came from.
I'll take a swing at that, and then Scott and Fred, if you want to tweak what I'm saying. So again, we can't speak for DEQ, and this has never been done. So this is how we think the program might work in our situation. It's just one permit, but I think it's envisioned that permit might be amended over time. So you would first construct your well, and then the regulations explicitly envision that DEQ would come out and inspect it and make sure that it meets all the mechanical integrity tests, it's constructed to all applicable standards. And then once the well is constructed, only then could you advance through a permit amendment or amendments to enable actual injection operations. So I think I would describe it as one permit that starts out with construction, and then it is amended sequentially over time as necessary, as more information about the project and the source becomes available. And it's only when all that information is known and DEQ has approved that entire package and understands precisely what is going to go on with that well and the geology into which it reaches will injection operations be authorized.
Yeah, agreed. Yep.
Then I should say all I meant to portray by that language was with respect to the technical aspects of it. After you drill that well, you'll have to take the new data you get from that well and cascade it through your different simulations and stuff. So,
yeah.
So what threshold of CO2 purification of the injected gas is required for it to be considered as CO2?
I can take that as well. So the regulations define what CO2 is. It's a standard definition that goes back to federal law. It's consistent with the federal program. It's essentially carbon dioxide that is allowed to have incidental materials that might have been carried over from the capture process, but the regulations explicitly prohibit the injection of a hazardous waste. So I think it would be a predominantly pure CO2 stream. You might have some incidental materials in there, but it certainly is not going to be, it's not required to be pharmaceutical grade CO2, for example. And that's pretty much the national standard, the federal standard. That's kind of how all these programs work, at least in my experience.
And I think, Kip, maybe the purity on the CO2 is more technically related in some ways, right? You have to get to that dense phase level, and But you're just not going to get any 45Q or for injecting things that aren't CO2. So even though you might do it as part of the process.
Right.
Okay. And next question from Christian, do you get a carbon credit for class 6 injection?
I feel like I'm talking too much. I can take a run at that. It depends upon what you mean by a carbon credit, and people, that's a term that is not precisely defined. If you mean the source that has to meet a Clean Air Act permit can satisfy its Clean Air Act emission permit by injecting it into a Class 6 well, yes. A Class 6 well can be used for legal compliance for emissions that would otherwise be going into the atmosphere. For a carbon credit, that would be things like offsets, for example. That would be the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard Program. A Class 6 permit by itself would not be sufficient by itself. You would have to do other things. It would involve the nature of the project, and it quickly gets complicated. We could answer that question offline, but I guess the answer is it depends.
Good answer for a lawyer. Okay.
That's why we have a lawyer on the team.
To tell us it depends. Okay, so we have already answered 23 or 24 questions. So nicely done, rapid fire. So thank you all. I have one more and then we'll close it out. I will say, I apologize. We have not gotten to everything. Some of the questions we had ahead of time, we haven't gotten to. So we'll figure out a way to get those to folks answered. So for our last question, if you're doing enhanced oil recovery, isn't a Class 2 permit more appropriate?
Yes, if you're doing EOR and that's what you're doing, that's a Class 2 permit. Yes, Class 6 is for saline CO2 storage.
Okay. So thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate it. Appreciate you being here, but also everything you guys do for Wyoming Carbon Safe and just to advance carbon capture, use, and storage and the energy industry in Wyoming. And I'll also thank our friends at the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute for leading this webinar and helping us put it together. We really appreciate that, and thank you for all your engagement. And we look forward to the next one. So folks, if you still have questions, keep them coming either to EORI or to SER, and we'll continue to try to support the state. We absolutely want to see CCUS projects happen here. So we're happy to help however we can. So thank you all. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks, everybody.